Joining me now, we have Dominic Chacon, Communications Coordinator with Sunrise El Paso.
Hello, good morning.
Also joining us by phone, we have Veronica Carbajal, President of Justicia Fronteriza.
Good morning, everyone.
Also on the phone, we have Christian Marquardt, Communications Coordinator with the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you all very much for joining us here, because what we are planning to do today, and this is going to be presented in a couple of formats, but primarily for our on-air audience, delving into some of these specifics and some of the major things going on with the El Paso Climate Charter. Proposition K, or Prop K for short, as it has been being discussed at length and in great ways, in many different ways in the community, including conversations I was hearing as of this morning. So it certainly has been a lot of focus. So with you all as representatives of both, Sunrise El Paso and related organizations, and the ones in proponents of this, we want to delve into the specifics, the language as it was developed, and the impacts that are expected to see, as well as the conversation that has been going on back and forth, analysis and responses to it. So we're going to be trying to break this down in a lot of ways. For our on-air audience, we're going to be taking you to the major, both how this organized, some things about the actual information, as well as some of the conclusions, actions to come. And this full interview, as we expect this to go on for more than an hour today, will be presented in its entirety online with the full video that we have. So that's at least a bit of a roadmap for how we're going to be handling this conversation today. So, Dominic, since we got you in studio here, let's start off with, how did this come about? We have, of course, longtime listeners of the show will know that we've previously talked about the petition drive that happened with us. I actually have the copy that was left with me, as it called for a petition to amend the city charter of El Paso to adopt a climate policy that would create jobs, conserve water, encourage solar power generation, and reduce the city's contribution to climate change. And so that was the effort that was going on, let's call it early, middle last year, give or take. And so kind of how did that end up coming about, and then ending up now where we are with, again, Proposition K, or Prop K?
Yeah, great question. I think it all started when the organization Sunrise El Paso started, which is back in 2018, 2019.
Okay.
So one of our first campaigns that we took on was the sale of El Paso Electric to JP Morgan Chase. And that was our first sort of introduction into, solar energy in the region, understanding the electric grid, and sort of taking this on as like our first campaign fight. And from that fight, we learned a lot about municipalization. We learned a lot about, the high rates of electricity we pay here in El Paso. We learned about all the sort of Texas policies, the agencies that are supposed to be overlooking the sale that kind of were not sort of doing their job to the standard that we expected them to. And so that sale ultimately went through for $4.3 billion, which was a debatable price, right? We had to really fight to make sure that JP Morgan Chase was identified as the owner of El Paso Electric, because they were using a lot of shell companies to buy the company. And ultimately the sale went through. We didn't kind of get the victory we wanted to, but that, as I say, is the origin of what sort of motivated the climate charter. And from there, the next fight that came after that was a Newman 6 power plant in which they built in Chaparral. And that was also a campaign that we took on to sort of center the community there in Chaparral. And unfortunately, we did not win that fight either, but we did get a settlement from the people, the community members that were there. And from that settlement, they gave it back to El Paso Sunrise, and they wanted us to continue the fight. And that is sort of the origin story of the El Paso Climate Charter. And so we had already initially been sort of in conversations with communities from the sale, talking about what would, environmental policy in the Southwest look like. And we got a lot of feedback. We got a lot of things related to housing, water, electricity, pollution, air quality, from community leaders and frontline people that are dealing with this on a very real way and a very daily basis. And so that was the ultimate source and the ultimate origin. And so from there, we worked with allies and other consultants to help us figure out how we can come together and create a basic policy, something that the Paso City can sort of adopt as just a starting place, just as a foundation to grow upon and to give the people power and give their voices more leverage in city council. So that is, I would say, the origin of that. And from there is where we got the El Paso Climate Charter.
Right. So again, there was a number of petition efforts that particularly happened last year, more than I can ever really recall happening in a variety of different ways, including some that were involved with, frankly, the work that you do. Specifically, Veronica, people may be familiar with you as among other things, a previous mayoral candidate, but particularly with Justicia Fronteriza, when you were doing that, there are some actual ballot initiatives that you are working on, and this was something that kind of as a, how would you describe it, as a kind of a coalition, as a cross purposes, or how would you put it?
Oh, definitely. So Justicia Fronteriza put forth around the same time as the Climate Charter a petition drive. Currently, the ballot rules require 2 rounds of signatures if council does not adopt the proposals. And the primary one is instituting campaign finance contribution limits at the city level. And so we firmly believe that if we were able to take out big money from local races, we wouldn't have to fight for things like climate justice, because we would get candidates that already have that commitment to the community instead of their big money donors. So these two fights really do are dovetail into one another. And also as a reminder, this May is the election, and the changes to the ballot initiative rules are on the ballot.
Right.
So we would eliminate the second round, and that is Proposition F, and we are asking people to vote yes on that as well.
Yes, because as much as we are talking about Proposition K, there are still A through J also on the ballot, so don't want to totally lose sight with that, as well as a number of different positions in school boards and even some of the municipalities in our area. So this is a stacked election, make no mistake, but we're going to primarily focus on Proposition K, as that has been certainly one of the lightning rod issues, one of the ones that's been brought up probably the most, if not overwhelmingly the most, out of all of the things that are on this current ballot. So when it comes to that, and it comes to the way this is being talked about, Christian, I'd actually like to bring you in for this one as communications coordinator for the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition, among other things. When now that has moved past the signature drive, the petition that was going around to get this on there, transitioning from that now into the actual language of it, for those playing along at home, ordinance number 019437, the one that called for this particular item to be on there, and it has a lot of the language that we're also going to be wanting to delve into, that then comes into and fully places on the ballot Proposition K. Can you talk a little bit about how then moving from the petition into this specific language, kind of how that process went?
Sure. Do you mean like drafting the language?
Sure thing. Yeah.
Andrew?
Yes.
Yeah. So the El Paso Climate Charter, the language was born from our experience in Sunrise El Paso and our collaboration and work with the frontline community in Chaparral in Northeast El Paso. The community is disproportionately, unfortunately, exposed to the impacts of the Newman 6 fracked gas-powered electric plant, which belongs to El Paso Electric. And so the beginning of drafting the El Paso Climate Charter completely stemmed from our shared fight with the Chaparral Community Coalition to try to prevent the expansion of the plant. And what ended up resulting of the case was the Chaparral community ended up in a settlement with El Paso Electric. And we saw that, we saw some very important, tangible outcomes stem from that settlement, including a 4-year moratorium on all fossil fuel projects, which meant that El Paso Electric could not create any new fossil fuel projects over the next 5 years. And so that was something that was very significant to the settlement, but it wasn't enough. And because the end goal of this fight against the expansion of Newman 6 was to prevent the community from being further polluted, as they were already exposed to amounts of pollution that were resulting and continue to result in a public health crisis in the Northeast El Paso and Chaparral area. And so, we worked hands-on, very collaboratively with community members, learned their stories too, and how our utility, which was now bank-owned, the expansion itself too was proposed practically immediately after the new CEO, Kelly Tomlin, came into her position at El Paso Electric, which was immediately after the purchase of the utility. And so we started to see and witness how, this chain reaction of how our community was starting to see the result of our utility becoming a monopoly that was also being operated by a bank, and a bank that happens to lead the climate crisis based on the oil projects that it funds. And so, the policy itself was birthed from the idea of how can we create something that restores power to the community, that gives us more leverage within also city government, to hold city government accountable, to hold the utility accountable, because there was a lot of pushback on the sale of the utility from community members and community leaders, and that went through anyway. There was a lot of pushback from the community on the expansion of Newman 6, and we were fighting this during COVID, right? So we're already thinking about a public health crisis and the impact it's having on our community members' health, and then witnessing an increase in emissions that would result from this plant. And so there was a huge fight there, pushback, and they proceeded with the expansion of this plant for $163 million from ratepayers, right? And we didn't have a say on how that would be invested, right? So in creating the climate charter language, it was really important for us to think, what can a comprehensive, thorough climate action policy look like that can simultaneously empower community members without burdening, the community itself? And instead, the document itself is thoroughly an accountability tool, a financial accountability tool, and a goal-reaching accountability tool for the city government and their investments to protect our community members and the decision-making, and how they are. It forces a conversation to happen more between the city government, the utility, and us, the ratepayers, the community members, because these conversations aren't taking place despite our consistent pushback. And so within the policy, you'll see here, for anyone who may be following along, the full language, of course, Article 9 here, climate policy, we very distinctly defined, even for like the climate director position, you are not qualified to apply as a climate director to work in that position if you have any ties, previous or current, to the fossil fuel industry. It establishes a climate department, and within that also a climate commission made up of residents, and it prioritizes the presence of frontline residents, those who are living by the refinery, living by the power plants, who can collaborate, right, and on strategy and city government planning, and be able to bring a voice back to the community in this decision making that continues to be lacking. It was really important as well, knowing in El Paso that our economy has remained stagnantly a low economy. We've seen very little economic growth, and the jobs that have been proposed to us to stimulate the economy have been jobs that aren't necessarily empowering to our community's needs. We've seen a lot of our community members take on jobs in the Permian, right, where we've seen our community members, family members, tackle jobs going to the oil rig. And we said we want to establish clean jobs in El Paso, clean, sustainable jobs. And so that was integrated into the policy. And, with that, we integrated goals for the city, too, for a transition to renewable energy, with this understanding that, El Paso is the 10th sunniest city in the world, and we only currently use 5% solar. And with our capacity to generate solar energy, we could be using far more in place of, these plants that are being used that are primarily operated through the use of, fracked gas that's conveyed via pipelines from the Permian. Whenever those emissions hit the air and interact with the sunlight and heat, it changes the chemical compound that creates a lot of the pollution that we're breathing in. And, in respect to our desert scape and our environment in El Paso, we have this opportunity to transition to renewable, to clean energy, because we happen to be one of those who receive the most sunlight on an annual basis, so we have this huge opportunity to make this transition. We have this natural resource that is the sun that can help us power our community, instead of constantly relying on gas that produces, again, these emissions that have ranked us the 12th worst for ozone pollution in the country. And so, throughout the document, Andrew, you'll see we do mention the goal of municipalizing El Paso Electric.
Right.
We do mention the goal of, creating a climate disaster mitigation and response plan. We've seen a lot of our frontline communities, who I also consider frontline communities, are those areas where every time during monsoon season that it floods, I've seen so many friends or loved ones who their car gets flooded, their homes are getting flooded, and it's just impossible. We don't have the appropriate way. We don't have an appropriate plan in place to mitigate also the way the climate crisis is persisting and affecting our community. And we also touch on water conservation and understanding that in our desert, our water resources are very precious and limited. With the climate crisis, we're seeing more drought happen. And with our proximity to the Permian Basin, it was really important to create, this section to ensure a lot of this is like a protective measure too, where, we mentioned banning the use of city water for fossil industry outside of the city limits, because with our proximity to the Permian Basin, we are very close and at risk of the Permian, trying to create, in quotes, business with us by buying our water resources and misusing them to further contribute to the climate crisis. And the Permian Basin right now uses, they produce 5.5 million barrels of oil a day. And for each barrel of oil, they use 7 barrels of water. And they expect this to double by 2030, where they produce 10 million barrels of oil a day. And that would require 70 million barrels of water a day. And so we can only anticipate, that with the access they have and, to our community, it was really important to us to try to set up a protective measure, right? Something that could protect our resources and ensure that these are being used within our city as our community intended them to be used. And that's what a lot of the document consists of. It's how can we protect our community? How can we empower our community? And how can we start, taking these next steps to bring green jobs to El Paso, to generate economic growth in El Paso, and also honoring the fact that our community has been left out of these really critical decisions in terms of our utility and our city government. And Proposition K is a way of taking that power back and restoring it to our community members.
Again, if you're just joining us, that right there speaking was Christian Marquardt, Communications Director with El Paso Climate Charter Coalition. Also on the phone with us is Veronica Carbajal, President of Justicia Fronteriza, and in studio with us, Dominic Chacon, Communications Coordinator with Sunrise El Paso. We are talking about Proposition K, the El Paso Climate Charter Amendment that is, of course, on the ballot this coming May. Don't forget, you can find the language of the actual ballot initiative itself here. If you go to epcountyvotes.com, you can find that item and where it is. But of course, remember that those election dates for this and the other things that are also on there: early voting April 24th through May 2nd, then election day May 6th of 2023. So let's talk a lot about some of the motivations and things going into the creation of the El Paso Climate Charter. So I want to start drilling down into the language of the actual charter amendment itself. I mean, the item on its own, Proposition K, is by far the longest one that is on this upcoming election here. I think it's somewhat longer than the rest of them combined, and lays out all of the individual sections, at least by name. But what we're actually going to be referring to here is the full ordinance, which has the actual exact language of what would be included. And so just kind of setting a baseline there, the Article 9, Climate Policy, Section 9.1. This is how the actual functional part of what would go on to the actual, again, charter of the city of El Paso, if approved by voters. Quote, it is the policy of the city of El Paso to use all available resources and authority to accomplish 3 goals of paramount importance. First, to reduce the city's contribution to climate change. Second, to invest in an environmentally sustainable future. And third, to advocate the cause of climate justice. Now, those are some mission statements, so to speak, and then the actual meat of it, getting into the actual actions that come with it, including some of the stuff you already referred to there, Christian, including the climate director and the creation of the climate department, among other things. Not to be confused with some of the previous ballot initiatives that have already gone through the actual bond issue that involved study of the similar thing. This would be a full and permanent department, not based on bond funds, among other things. So, continuing on with that then, and the first section includes definitions of what the creation of the climate department is, and then you did mention there again the qualifications for the actual climate director, but there have been, just kind of going from the start of it here, looking specifically at section 9.2, the definitions. There are things such as climate change, climate jobs, and climate justice. One of the questions actually has come up when it comes to climate jobs, defined here as jobs that advance one or more of the city's policy objectives of 1, reducing the city's contribution to climate change, 2, investing in an environmentally sustainable future, and 3, advocating the cause of climate justice. Tell you what, we'll get to that one here in just a minute because it's referenced a little bit later on, but one of the other definitions, including the fossil fuel industry. Now, the way that, Christian, specifically, you've been bringing this up has been along the lines of production and energy generation when you're referring to either some of the power plants that exist in our region or have come up, or when it comes to the Permian Basin, as you're referring to the Midland, Odessa areas, what I consider it in general. One of the questions has come up, particularly since there are, and this is one of the better known provisions within, I want to say, besides the municipalization part of the actual climate policy, is that about the water supply. So you kind of mentioned that is going to, and the focus on that part of this going towards those essentially fossil fuel generation and the creation, production, etc. But one of the questions that has come up is when it comes to the actual, like, say, gas stations and the ones that currently exist, when it comes to that definition, again, under definition E, under section 9.2 of the proposed climate charter, when it comes to how that would affect gas stations, it's not necessarily explicitly listed because the closest I think you could get would be under definition F, under that subsection, companies that provide services to assist companies that conduct any of the activities described, which include, again, production, drilling, power generation, etc. Is it y'all's position that this would or would not include gas stations specifically?
Correct, Andrew. It's our position that this would not include gas stations specifically.
Okay.
There has been some misinformation being circulated surrounding the transition to electric vehicles or the transition to electrical appliances, and it is our position that this is not specifically targeting at all gas stations, the type of vehicle folks drive, the type of appliances that are used in households, more specific to our electric grid, and how energy is being generated in our community.
And on that point then, there has been conversation that has come up to me when it comes to specifically, appliances. And gas stoves often come up, but also there's the idea of, HVAC systems, heat pumps have also been mentioned. Now, there certainly has been a national conversation that's been going on that, on the availability, any laws proposed that will be dealing with it. To my reading, I don't see, at least the way I look at it, any explicit mention of that. Is it your all's position that effectively, if this were to be passed, there would be any impact on essentially individual appliances in residential homes?
Exactly. Yeah, this has nothing to do with energy usage as individual ways, and more has to do with how we create our electricity and the fossil fuel industry used to create electricity via El Paso Electric and fracked gas. So your gas stove, you're not producing energy in that way. You're not, heating up your home using your gas stove. These services are not in the climate charter. Nowhere does it say anything about banning gas stoves, about banning your car, or forcing any sort of electrification of your personal appliances. This is mainly talking about industries. And we often see this time as like a talking point, not only just from this case in El Paso Climate Charter, but all environmental movements and messaging. There's this focus that the weight of the change is going to come on individuals, right? Individuals are going to have to take quicker showers. We're going to have to use less waste. We're going to have to do all these things while these industries maintain their systems. That's the opposite of what we're trying to do. We're trying to say that the industries are the ones who need to adjust because they disproportionately have a bigger impact on our climate crisis. If all of us took shorter showers, 5 minutes less in each shower, it would do nothing to address the water usage from El Paso Electric, right? It would just take one new hydrofracking facility to reverse all the people who did take 5 minutes less in their shower. So that is a classic sort of talking point to sort of distract from the conversation about what we're actually trying to do, which is hold these industries accountable.
So moving through on more, and thank you for that answer, on to the actual climate charter of it is, there are some things, of course, being said about the, qualifications, as you did mention, for the climate director. That's not one of the finer points that I want to drill down into because it's not much question that I have on that about, again, not being able to have been from part of the fossil fuel industries. But when it comes to particularly the climate impact of city decisions, sections 9.5 within the actual letter and actual ordinance of the item that would be then again, if this were to be voted on, says that the climate director shall provide city council with climate impact statements prior to any city council vote affecting the city's climate policy. And these are the ones that are explicitly listed as being but included but not limited to adoptions of city budget and any amendments thereto, zoning decisions, right-of-way permits, new or expanded streets, roads, highways, bridges, and other significant infrastructure, capital improvement projects, including proposed capital improvements put to the public in the form of bond issues, new subdivision approvals, and procurement decisions. And in my maybe not too generous analysis, that sounds like most city business. Is that kind of the intention to put this layer on pretty much all decisions, or how do you all end up kind of breaking this down?
Right. And I think, Andrew, a lot of like this section, especially, this is one of those parts of the policy that emphasizes the importance of the transparency of city government and the decision making. It identifies which areas and how we're contributing worse to the climate crisis. And even that in itself, we could look at this from the lens of even like environmental racism. Is this project going to displace community members, and what does that impact look like? And it also provides this opportunity for the climate director to engage more with city government to provide a better insight and understanding and on their decision making and what that impact is. We typically, it's typically pretty impossible for a lot of El Pasoans to attend, city council meetings to understand what's happening at every second, every moment of every day. To have someone in that city government can actually collaborate with to find, solutions to, tackling these. I'm so sorry, Andrew. I missed exactly what I was trying to get at here. But the city, when they're making these decisions, establishing, like providing right-of-way permits, expanding streets or highways, for example, it's very probable that in many instances they're not very aware of what that impact will have on our community. And it's really important to be able to have that transparency and that conversation between the city government, community members, and then a climate director, someone who can, make this information, for one, more accessible and known to the public, and two, be able to collaborate more with city government to identify what would be better alternatives or possible solutions to still achieve what needs to be done, but in a way that's, more geared towards climate justice and doesn't sacrifice the well-being of our community members. An example here could be the proposed expansion of the I-10. And that's going to be going through like parts of like Sunset Heights, and expanding it risks the displacement of all of our community members. It increases the amounts of emissions that are passing even through those parts of town on the freeway, which the freeway just pretty much goes straight through El Paso already.
Right.
So that would be an example, right, where like the climate director could provide like hey, this is the impact that this project is going to have on the community. And it's kind of someone that can, reemphasize, these points to city government of like, hey, this is how you're contributing to furthering the climate crisis in our community, climate injustice in our community. And then, along with other sections and roles of the role of the climate director being able to collaborate between city government and climate director to make better decisions overall for the community. And that includes, the climate commission as well, which is a little bit lower there on the document.
Right.
It was their collaboration and their input as well. Because we're seeing a lot of efforts constantly being tackled where, there's not, community feedback isn't really being integrated despite the amount of pushback or dialogue that's trying to be created, right, or opened up between city government and our community members. So this is another way of increasing that transparency and just recognizing, like, what are the ways that we are harming the community or further impacting, our environmental, like, our wellness. So, yeah, that would be my response to that, Andrew.
Okay. And then kind of one more point on this before we end up moving on. When it comes to then the process of actually doing that, actually putting it in place, right now, I mean, there is a whole process that goes behind items that are added on to the city council agenda. The kind of most front-facing part of that is that basically every Thursday there are items added on to the city council agenda that then are then seen by the general public ahead of the meeting coming up next with work session on Monday and then the city council meeting on Tuesday. So when it comes to then the back end of what it takes from the initial actual proposition of an item to go onto the city council agenda, is there any anticipation of what that will do to, say, the lead time for then items to come before, if these are going to be required to be having this presentation or inclusion in any presentation before it actually moves before city council for, say, voter action?
It's going to be asking for more direct transparency. So it's not going to say every city council meeting you have to come up with the newest assessment, right?
Sure.
It's going to be actually prompting transparency from other industries such as El Paso water utilities. Another good example would be the Great Wolf Lodge that was going to be built in the Lost Dog Trail, which was a couple years ago, right? A lot of that campaigning was done without that information, right? What is the impact if we build this Great Wolf Lodge on the west side of of El Paso on the mountains, right? What are we going to be impacting wildlife-wise, land-wise, waterways, things like that? How are we going to, as a city, put infrastructure to make sure that they have the water that they were asking for their water slides? All those things are already happening and kind of without that transparency. So this is going to be asking for that, and if anything, putting it in the responsibility of the city to, at some point in that process, right, to have an impact assessment. Not necessarily every city council meeting or every meeting on the subject, but just at some point there needs to be an impact assessment done by the city, which is going to be forcing these other agencies to be transparent with their information, to show us their numbers, which is not the case currently.
Okay, so I mean, certainly for the large items, and that makes sense. But say, for example, there are on this upcoming, the one as we are recording actually today, there is a city council meeting going on, and again, that agenda item that has been agenda fully has been put out again as of last week. There are even on this one a number of different designations, a number of different plans that are being put forth, including maybe not exactly right-of-way work, but contracts being awarded in a variety of ways to the tune of hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, if not low millions, and these different kinds of projects. And considering that there is also that item that passed in this most recent election back in November, the whole streets and roads infrastructure locally that passed along with that. And there's going to be, increasing amount of actions happening with that. Certainly, as I believe they're still in the study period, but it would seem that those types of items, by the definition we're talking about here again, right-of-way permits, new or expanded streets, roads, highways, or bridges, or other significant infrastructure, that each time these things come up on the ballot, by the language as I'm reading it, would require these types of analysis to be included before or as it goes to city council votes. Is that kind of the intention, or how you all read this as then being in action when it comes to this?
Yes, and it's sort of just setting the baseline that, we should always be considering some sort of environmental impact assessment. Even if it is as simple as like easements and roads, we want to be asking ourselves, where are these easements going? Are they helpful? Are they hurtful? And some impact assessments are going to be, oh, well, we're adding a sidewalk. It's not really too much of an impact assessment, but we're going to acknowledge that an impact assessment is needed, versus, a really big project like Christian said, expanding I-10. This is going to have lots and lots of more environmental impacts. Some are going to be related to, our air, our water, and environmental impacts, and a lot of them are also going to be talking about that environmental justice, aka the human impact and the human environment that is going to be impacted in those ways. So it's sort of setting the baseline. The city council doesn't have to do an entire, 100-page long assessment for each vote, but it's sort of setting that as the sort of standard that we want to have some sort of assessment, some sort of impact assessment.
So essentially, I think that it comes down to, at least the way it's kind of been expressed to me, that say, for example, a specific item on today's agenda, item number 23, discussion and action that the city manager be authorized to sign an advance funding agreement, amendment number 2, by and between the city of El Paso and the state of Texas, acting by and through the Texas Department of Transportation for Sean Haggerty Drive Extension Project, and then goes through the dollar amounts in the millions, with the total project cost of $28 million so far in this case. Local government participation, $1.8 million and change. So when it comes to items like that are then on there, are there been existing projects are coming up, would it be that type of item that would therefore need this type of climate impact statement?
I'm under the impression, yes.
So then the kind of question that comes up to that is, would it be something that would then add would this be on a rolling basis where the climate department would be needing to essentially have of every potential item already be generating something, or would it be once it's actually added onto the agenda, as it is, again, item 23 as of today, 4/11/2023, that they would then have to begin generating that? And would that lead to any kind of, further outlays for how city business would then actually be able to come onto the agenda?
Well, that's exactly why we need a climate director, right? We need somebody whose job it is to consistently be requiring that this process takes place. We want accountability. Sean Haggerty is my neck of the woods, and there's a whole rainwater collection area out there. Even as they're trying to extend Sean Haggerty, which I believe they should. There's assessments to be made, right? There's impacts. There's going to be lots of construction impacts. There's going to be lots of environmental impacts. And so that in and of itself is creating the basis for why we should do that. And then the climate director and the climate role would be giving resources to always have that impact assessment.
Again, if you're just joining us, that's Dominic Chacon, Communications Coordinator for Sunrise El Paso. Also joining us on the phone are Veronica Carbajal, President of Justicia Fronteriza, and Christian Marquardt, Communications Coordinator with the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition. If you want to find any more information about some of the things we're talking about, we're referring to some city council agendas there, but specifically for the organizations that we're talking about here, there's sunriseelpaso.org, sunriseelpaso.org, and then specifically for the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition, there is elpasoclimate.org, elpasoclimate.org. So, that's one of the questions that has come up, but there's, of course, a lot more. I mean, the entire ordinance that comes into putting this item, if again voted on by voters and approved, onto and actually into the charter, the entire ordinance is about 10 pages, and I want to say the most actionable, besides the ballot language itself, probably about 6 pages, give or take, primarily. So, looking even further into this, beyond that, Section 9.6, tracking climate emissions, an annual report. That would be, through the process of the actual climate department. But then climate jobs, Section 9.7 has had another major question on it. Starting off with the first section of it, a city manager shall collaborate with the climate director to create an annual goal for the creation of climate jobs, including specific goals for each city department. This goal shall be announced when the city manager proposes the city's annual budget. Now, that's kind of an intro, and one of the biggest questions that comes out of this section actually comes from the Section 9.7-3, transitioning current city employees to climate work. I'll just read this part here. As part of the city manager's annual goal for climate jobs pursuant to Section 9.7 7.1, the city manager shall identify opportunities to transition current city employees into positions that would qualify for climate jobs. This requirement shall not be construed to encourage elimination of any existing city employee. Rather, the city manager shall identify opportunities to transition existing personnel into new positions with equal or superior pay and benefits that would advance the city's climate policy. Now, kind of in a nutshell, the questions that we have had on this is that, are we talking about the creation of these new positions? Would this be something still within the city, like say within the climate policy department, or are we talking about private industries? Essentially, what is the scope and what would the outcome be of these transitions?
Sorry.
I can speak to that one, Andrew. Or were you going to, Dom?
No, go for it.
Yeah, go right ahead.
If you'd like.
Go ahead, Kristen.
Okay, no, perfect. So, yeah, in terms of the annual goal for climate jobs, so it would be within the climate director and city manager's collaboration to establish a goal for creating climate jobs. And yeah, and that section that you mentioned, Andrew, transitioning current city employees to climate work could most definitely mean transitioning city employees to the climate department, right?
Okay.
Because there's a lot of ways. The only position that is required to be funded, the only thing that's required to be funded from the document itself is the climate director position. And that's because there's a lot of ways that the climate director and city manager can collaborate to find ways to, like in this case, this section, which you read, Andrew, 9.7-3, transitioning current city employees, these could easily transition folks to the climate department without having to, account for building a new budget necessarily, right? Instead, we're just transitioning jobs where maybe city manager in collaboration with the climate director, they're observing like, hey, if this person would have this experience, and right now maybe they're not as needed in this department or whatever that may be, right? And there's a way to be very innovative about like the structure of the climate department and what the needs are. Because we can anticipate that the climate director would be taking the lead on a lot of the requirements, such what's the goals that are being pursued by that position, what needs to be fulfilled by that role. However, there is, of course, also within the policy, it does state, that the climate director be provided with the resources and the staffing necessary to try to achieve those goals as well. So we could anticipate that there could also be like a lot of opportunity here to transition folks who already have that experience working within the city to, support the climate department and the goals of the climate department. And equally so, there's just that opportunity to be more innovative about how we're using our city resources as well. Fusing maybe certain departments, and a lot of that falls back on, the city government and city manager. And how they choose to, distribute those roles or develop these jobs. And a lot of it's going to require just a lot of, collaboration between the climate director, city manager, city council, and determining, what are our needs? How can we be very efficient and strategic and innovative about how we're creating these jobs and generating more revenue for the community? How can we be resourceful? So that's one of those conversations that definitely ties back to the collaboration again between the climate department and city government. Yeah.
So then, particularly on that point, then about the climate department manager, as well as then the city manager overall. Of course, there's been some conversation going on about the city manager form of government. This not totally wrapped up in this, but it does raise the question of essentially what will the flow of organization look like upon the creation of the climate departments? Because you mentioned a collaboration between the city manager and the climate policy manager, and when it comes to that, essentially what would be the flow? Would the climate department and the director of it end up falling still under the city manager, or would this be, it almost kind of sounds like you're describing something like co-equal or along those lines? So what is the form, function, and plan for, again, just how the organization will flow if this were again approved by voters?
Right, and so the intent would be, Andrew, that the climate director would serve its role not necessarily under the supervision of the city manager, but again more in collaboration. I think it would be more outside of the city manager's purview as far as like their scope of work and what their what their focus is on, like running the city, and a lot of what the climate director does a lot of that work is just meant to be done more collaboratively. We would expect that the climate director position, of course, whoever would be taking on that role would meet those expectations, have that experience and qualifications to run the department. Again, though, with implementing the policy too, a lot of this is going to depend on how the city government interprets the policy itself. So there are some things that we can anticipate, maybe learning more developments on how is this going to be more efficient for city government. And so, a lot of the policy itself, it's going to depend more on that implementation process, right, which might open more conversations up and seeing, how the city government chooses to implement, all of the sections of the charter amendment. However, that would also, go back to even the climate director position, that the role was written intentionally so as to make that distinction between the climate director position was created to serve the community very directly, and one of the ways of protecting its functioning is to keep it more separate and collaborative with the city manager in place of it being a role that is overseen by the city manager, right? There's a lot of specifics in the climate charter that protect the role from being, having those shoes filled by someone with any special interests related to the fossil fuel industry.
Right, like we mentioned.
That was the intention of also, keeping those roles separate but collaborative, was to ensure that role is in many ways maintained to the integrity of the community and not, it was a way of protecting the way that role serves the community.
So to kind of give an example then, in city council meetings currently, of course, there's the dais that has, the city, the mayor and the city representatives, and then there are city staff kind of opposite facing them and in front of the audience, the major sitting areas within city council. And we've got, of course, the city manager kind of, at least I'm looking at it the right way, thinking about it the right way. If you're in the center of the room off to the left, there is the city manager, some of his staff sitting next to him, and then there's also the city attorney, as not exactly under the city manager, but often speaking up in different ways and leading different kinds of discussion. Is it kind of the intention in that case to have this in a similar type of positioning, not even necessarily just within the room, but in terms of speaking and in making points whenever we're talking about different types of action or questions arising?
Yeah, most definitely, Andrew. I think that would be the main part of that position. I think going back to one of the sections you mentioned earlier too, regarding the actual climate director position, let me see if I can find this here really quickly, referring to the document.
9.3.
Where are we here? Yeah, so one of those sections too, it does specify, that the climate director would have to be continuously being updated by city government. The city manager would keep that position updated, so that way they can contribute in city council meetings, being able to provide those climate impact statements. So they would very much be working hands-on with city council and taking part in those meetings, and serve in that positioning, as you mentioned, similar to how the city attorney is also someone that they would refer to in different instances, right, where it applies. So they would be that resource to city government as well in their position.
Okay. Again, if you're just joining us, that's Christian Marquardt, Communications Coordinator for the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition. Also joining us on the phone is Veronica Carbajal, President of Justicia Fronteriza. And then, of course, with us in studio right now, we do have Dominic Chacon, Communications Coordinator with Sunrise El Paso. So, yeah, that's kind of one of the positioning questions that has come up for me. But then moving on to the next section after the one involving the actual climate department transitioning current city employees to climate work, etc. Section 9.8, solar energy, and the solar power generation plan as the first one of it, which says the climate director shall create an annual solar power generation plan for the city of El Paso. That has essentially been one of the questions, is of the scope of that, because of course, we have the city of El Paso as a concept and the place place where, the vast majority of our listening audience lives, among other things, and including the bulk of the population of El Paso County itself. But the way that it's listed here has raised questions of, particularly when it comes to, say, the 9.8-2 rooftop solar power generation. The city manager shall establish and maintain policies that encourage development of rooftop solar power generation capacity within the city of El Paso. Essentially, the question is of, again, the scope of that. Are we talking about the entirety, the population, every building within El Paso? Or are we talking specifically about the city of El Paso and the government, and therefore basically primarily governmental buildings of El Paso? Or what is that scope?
I can answer that one. I served on the Regional Renewable Energy Advisory Committee, and that's for the city of El Paso, and that brought together local people to discuss, how the city of El Paso can be pushing forward these things. And that was one of the very popular conversations that we tried to have. It's like, how can city of El Paso simply retrofit its own buildings, its own, libraries, public spaces, buildings to be solar energy and to be self-sufficient. That way they don't have to be paying millions of dollars to El Paso Electric for their own electricity. They can simply upfront the cost themselves and then start to save money on that way. So that is kind of what it's talking about. How do we get the city to do its own buildings, right? To make sure that it has its own capacity to produce its own electricity and sort of cut itself away from El Paso Electric. And that's kind of also feeds into that municipalization aspect, Municipalization, as told by, El Paso Electric and the Chamber of Commerce, simply means buy or purchase. Right. But that's not necessarily the case. Municipalization outlines many different ways and factors and powers that the city has in which it can start to provide its own electricity without having to go through El Paso Electric. So that's sort of the initial, and I wouldn't say it just pertains to the city of El Paso, but other public industry or institutions such as school districts or UTEP. It can expand to other public spaces that the city can help get them to have solar rooftop.
But when it comes to the requirements here, again, the way it's written, and I know this doesn't come through audio that well, but it's the solar generation plan for the capital C city of El Paso. So essentially in this language, I guess the real questions come up to, in this language, it's referring to not necessarily, again, the general population, but specifically the entity of the government of the city of El Paso, and therefore their buildings.
Yeah, it's a generation capacity within the city of El Paso. So it's within the city, the boundaries of the city. The city would then have the power to help support those rooftop solar projects within the city, not just the city government itself and city buildings, but the city of El Paso.
So, the city of El Paso, you mentioned other buildings, certainly, but really, of course, internal capacity to generate energy to the city through solar power at the end of that 9.8-1, I guess, is essentially the requirement, or the most part that'll be focused on being on, again, city, government buildings, essentially being the requirement, being put forth here.
Can you rephrase that question?
So, there eventually have been questions of, are all of the new houses, warehouses, private buildings going to be required to have solar generation on them, or does this policy primarily pertain, again, to the entity that is the government of the city of El Paso, even if there is a scope of the entirety of the city limits, that the ones that will see this particularly, again, Section 9.8 solar energy focused on primarily the buildings and therefore the power requirements within of those, again, like the many different city, we've of course got City Hall and the city, the different buildings, the way that they're numbered, would that be the primary focus of this part?
Yeah, I want to be really clear that nothing in the charter is saying requirement, especially in 9.82, it specifically says these policies shall encourage development of rooftop solar power generation using existing city facilities that require both new buildings and retrofitted buildings to include solar power generation capacity whenever feasible. So this is not saying that every new house that's being built in El Paso must then have solar energy or solar panels. It's just saying they're going to encourage, we're going to incentivize, if you are going to bring a new business here and you want to build something in our beautiful community, we're going to encourage and support you if you'd like to have rooftop solar in your on top of your new building or warehouse, whatever. And so it's also having that nuance of saying that the city then will also have that power to incentivize its own building in its own capacity to do that thing.
So then that leads me to then about section 9.9, the renewable energy goals. I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this one. The city of El Paso shall employ all available methods to require that energy used within the city is generated by clean renewable energy, with the goals of requiring 1, 80% clean renewable energy by 2030, and 2, 100% clean renewable energy by 2045. So this is a section that does have specific requirements about, not necessarily solar specifically, but of the clean renewable energy, which is one of the things that I do believe is, well, maybe not exactly within the, okay, it is section F of the clean renewable energy back in the definitions at the top of the document. So this one does have requirements, and this one saying not just the city of El Paso, but used within the city as well. So this would be of all power generated.
Yes. And that one is probably the crux of El Paso, the El Paso Chamber of Commerce, very big deal that they're making about this. But these goals are set also by other existing cities in Texas, as well as within New Mexico. So New Mexico, the state, already has very similar, if not the same goals, requiring of El Paso Electric to start doing the same goals by 2045 and by 2023. So again, this doesn't have any sort of reinforcement mechanism behind it, right? This charter is just the foundation to give the city room to say, hey, we have these goals. We need you to work towards these goals. Nobody is going to get, arrested or fined if they do not meet these goals or if they struggle to. And if anything, El Paso Electric, in its own goals and its own statements, have said that we don't need the climate charter because they're already going towards these goals. They're already, so this is a way of putting accountability in those industries who say these things, right? So these goals that are set are not goals that we just came up with because we want them to hurt or to have to struggle. These are goals that are already within the state of Texas, certain cities, as well as in New Mexico, and as well as on the website of El Paso Electric. So as far as requiring, it's
right.
That's the language that I guess everybody is getting caught up on, but it's more requiring the energy source to be requiring that it be sustainable energy by 2023.
And we will say it is, there was on the drive-in today a billboard that has been put forth by El Paso Electric saying, it said carbon neutral or carbon zero by 2045, but these have been goals been put forth with that. But again, you mentioned about there not being any penalties, but then what is essentially the impetus behind the requiring aspect of it? A lot of these different things are goals. By the setting of goals, of creating of plans, and doing these kind of things. But this is the one that does say requiring specifically. So if it's not going to be fines, fees, those kind of things, what will then be the impetus, the essentially accountability behind that then?
Great question. It's requiring renewable energies. It's requiring renewable energies, not carbon neutral energies. Carbon neutral is a code word for fossil fuel industries to come up with a new technology that doesn't exist yet, that they're saying we're going to have a technology that's going to be able to make fossil fuels carbon neutral and carbon zero carbon. So that's what when the word requirement is you see it there, it's requiring renewable energy. It's so that's a very specific statement so that we step away from that zero carbon, neutral carbon, which honestly, I would encourage you all to go ask El Paso Electric what they mean by that, because it's very unclear. But the term requirement, as I'll read it out here, says, the city of El Paso shall employ all available methods to require that energy used within the city is generated by clean and renewable energy within the goals, right? The goals, not like a hard set requirement. The goal of 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2045. So the only requirement is that it's renewable energies.
And so going back to that real quick, just because I feel it's relevant to say, back in the section F of the definitions, clean renewable energy defined as energy generated without burning carbon or releasing greenhouse gases, includes renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, hydroelectric, and geothermal, includes hydrogen energy that is processed by splitting water by electrolysis, quote-unquote green hydrogen, or hydrogen produced by solar-driven processes, but does not include hydrogen energy produced using natural gas, blue or gray hydrogen, or nuclear pink hydrogen. So in general, that has been one of the other questions, not necessarily explicitly listed here, but the mention of nuclear, in the ways that, again, electrolysis and hydrogen production comes from. What is the position? It is decidedly not a fossil fuel, but not exactly listed within, again, the goals or the requirements then of that kind of power generation. What is essentially the position of the Climate Charter and of, I guess, again, Sunrise El Paso and the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition on nuclear in general?
Another great question. So those... I'm sorry, Vero.
Go ahead.
So sorry, this is Christian here, Andrew. No, and I did just want to reinforce the fact that with the establishing of these goals and integrating this into the charter, it does reinforce the pursuit of implementing and reaching these goals, right? So, Again, to reiterate, the policy itself is an accountability tool for the community to ensure that El Paso Electric, as an example here, because they are the ones who control our electrical grid, they have promises to decarbonize 100% by 2045. And if you look at their timeline for their gas-powered plants, those continue on into the year 2060 and on. And so what this does is it requires, the utility to be held accountable to its word to ensure that transition is being done. And here we are focusing on solar energy within El Paso because of our capacity to generate solar as a renewable energy source. El Paso being the 10th sunniest city in the world, and we only use 5% of it to power El Paso. We have this natural resource already available to us. The amount of energy we could generate on an annual basis is it just makes it seem very it's just confusing to see that there's a lack of investment in transitioning to especially solar energy in a community that uniquely benefits from it. A lot of cities don't have that opportunity to benefit from this natural resource that we get to benefit from year round if we were to use it, appropriately and actually integrate it into our energy sourcing, which we don't. And so that is what these renewable energy, like these sections do under solar energy, is that it encourages this transition of city property to clean renewable energy and starting that implementation of solar, which coincides with some of the goals of Proposition C, which was also passed, which you mentioned earlier, Andrew. And then in this section of renewable energy goals, this is what is holding the utility accountable, because they can tell our communities from one day to the next, yes, we plan to decarbonize. Suddenly we're in the year 2045 and these gas plants are still on for the next 20 years. And that promise was not made. And at that point, we understand that there is a timeline here on the global scale to begin to make these transitions in our communities to clean energy. And El Paso, having that unique opportunity that we already have access to a natural resource that is the sun, to take the lead on climate action in Texas, this is what this section does. And there's a lot of other communities and other cities who've engaged with this work we're doing here with Proposition K, and this section especially, because we know that there are a lot of companies that their interests are to protect their profits that they make from the fossil fuel industry and not to think outside of the box. It's easier for them to rely on what has been business as usual to continue making their profits off of the community versus, in this instance, we are enforcing the pursuit of a very attainable goal because we already have that unique access to the sun and to generate solar energy. And so that is what this prioritizes in Section 9.9 under renewable energy goals. It's it enforces the pursuit without enforcing, the implementation of it. If we don't have the resources available to make that transition, and even so, as an example too here, Andrew, El Paso Electric invested 163. Well, you can call it an investment if you want. I don't know that that's an investment, right? Because it could have been done in this way. El Paso Electric used $163 million of ratepayer money to expand a fracked gas-powered electric plant. $163 million with a lot of community pushback, people asking for renewable energy projects to grow in our community, right? They just recently published, they're very proud of this new solar farm that they built close to Chaparral, and yet we still have Newman 6 that is emitting all of these, it's apart from it's a distraction from what they continue to do in our community. And they're not using our money responsibly. They're not using it in ways that will be sustainable for the future of El Paso. And that is what Section 9.9 does. It ensures that these goals that the company supposedly is already following themselves, it ensures that they now have to work towards these goals and transition our energy sourcing.
And I get your perspective on that. And I understand the goals that are coming up with that. But a specific question that has come up that is not explicitly within the climate charter, either this section or really any of the others by my reading of it, is, again, in the regards to nuclear energy. Again, specifically that one portion that refers to the electrolysis and energy sourced from that for the use of hydrogen energy is about the only mention of essentially nuclear power. So effectively, the question that I have and has come up to me is, in terms of the climate charter or even y'all's position, what is the position towards nuclear energy as a source? Again, I say not incentivized, but also not explicitly listed under like the same kind of bounds that fossil fuels are. So that's kind of the question that I've been having come up that is, again, not explicitly in here, but is still of concern, like to our listening audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that don't know, we get some of our electricity from a nuclear power plant in New Mexico. And so while in the position of the climate charter, we are not including nuclear energy as a fossil fuel.
Right, but also not incentivized either.
Exactly.
Correct.
Go ahead, Christian.
Nuclear energy is not a renewable energy source. And so because of El Paso's capacity to generate solar energy, our emphasis has always been on increasing solar generation in El Paso for that reason. And because we already have access to this natural resource that is renewable, we would, of course, instead prefer to prioritize a clean renewable resource versus nuclear, which has, more recently it posed a threat in a community more up north in the United States. And I believe it was Minnesota. There was some danger there. So we're looking for, not just other ways of energy sourcing, period, but taking advantage of the fact that we can generate clean, sustainable energy through, El Paso's capacity to receive, generate solar energy itself. So we want to prioritize the overall well-being of our community, and then also just taking advantage of that unique resource we have that is, the ability to generate solar energy in El Paso.
And yeah, certainly that's pretty apparent and the purpose, but it's in the text here. But I guess based on your responses there, would it be fair to say that the El Paso Climate Charter, except for that, again, one mention of the electrolysis provided by nuclear energy, is otherwise neutral when it comes to specifically like direct nuclear power generation? Would that be fair to say?
In the El Paso Climate Charter, yes, that's what it's expressing. We're not right now ready at this point to like cut ourselves off from that nuclear power plant. Okay. But like Christian said, this would set us up to really prioritize solar energy. And the first thing we can really cut off is the fossil fuels. And so that's the mission of the climate charter. Right now, the climate charter is not taking a position against against nuclear.
Nuclear. Energy. In favor of solar, opposed to fossil fuel, neutral on nuclear energy, kind of in a nutshell. Okay, fair enough. So then moving on to then section 9.10, one of the, not the longest section, but certainly one of the ones that has been talked about the most. That is the municipalization of El Paso Electric. And so just to read that one briefly, the city of El Paso shall employ all available efforts to convert El Paso Electric to municipal ownership. In consultation with the climate director, the city manager shall provide the city council with an annual report to describe the feasibility of converting El Paso Electric into a municipal electric company, including any actions required to advance this objective. Now, this one is very much talking about goals, and there is not a lot of specificity in what is in there. So when it comes to the scope of available efforts, I mean, the phrase has some apparent meaning that basically everything is on the table, but in consultation with you all, as you have put this item before, what kind of methods or reasonable actions would you all imagine could be taken in order to have that then happen?
Well, first thing first is a feasibility study, right? We need to assess what are the assets, what are they worth, and this again is something that came from the sale of El Paso Electric the first time. Because what really raised flags during that sale was the price tag of $4.3 billion.
Right.
Everybody was like, what the heck? Who is going to be paying $4.3 billion for this electric company out here with a very limited, we are a captured market, but we're not like expanding rapidly or anything like that.
Okay.
And so that is what raised a lot of red flags. And so that $4.3 billion sale is what we were asking the city of El Paso to do a feasibility study to really assess what is the value of El Paso Electric's assets, what is it really worth, because at that time the city had a lot of power with the sale to interject and to say, you know what, we actually want to municipalize, or we want to take partial ownership, or we want to do this stuff. So that feasibility study never happened. We got a feasibility study about a feasibility study, you know, to see if doing a feasibility study would be feasible, but we didn't actually get a study done, which is why that's the important first step. Until we have a fair assessment of what the value is, all these numbers being spit out by El Paso Electric and the Chamber of Commerce are simply how they feel it is valued, right? It's simply just because JP Morgan Chase, one of the richest banks in the world, paid $4.3 billion for El Paso Electric doesn't necessarily mean that that's how much it's worth. And so the process of municipalization is using all the powers within the city that they have used before. For example, against Duranguito, right? When they wanted to use their power as a city to
eminent domain specifically?
Eminent domain, okay. Not only that, but like devaluing the properties of the buildings, allowing for people within the chamber and other oligarchs to sort of purchase up these things, these properties. There's all kinds of pressure campaigns, you know, to hold out providing basic services for, like, again, people in Duranguito is a perfect example of that.
Okay.
But the city has an array of tools that they can be using to accurately value or devalue what they think is worth, and to make a pitch to be like, okay, you're saying it's worth this much, but we're going to be willing to pay this much, and use their powers as a city to municipalize. Municipalization also means, as we talked about earlier, the city being able to use its own powers to cut itself off from El Paso Electric. And so there's an array of things that the city can be doing to municipalize, but it really comes down to that feasibility study that we've been asking for about 4 or 5 years now.
That there has been some information, and we're going to get more into this studies once we're through the text of this, as there has been a number of different layers, both from y'all, from some of the other organizations, from the city itself, among other things, about costs associated with this, and there has been a number that has been given, at least from the city's perspective, on those feasibility studies. We'll talk about that here in a minute, but essentially, when kind of the phrase that I take it to mean about all available efforts to convert El Paso Electric to municipal ownership, meaning everything's on the table, you mean truly the true full span and scope of powers, including, I mean, would it be on the table in this case to essentially do eminent domain on even the individual power generation or substations of El Paso Electric?
I think that's a question for the city to be discussing, and so we don't want to like say what the city should be doing and how they should be doing, but we want to make it clear that there's a lot of tools that the city has, right, outside of just digging into their pockets to pay $9 billion for the asking price of El Paso Electric. And so this is really just meant to sort of start the conversation and to really shed light on, you know, that Moscow study that they talked about, the economic impact assessment from the consulting firm in Moscow, Idaho.
Which we will, again, also be talking about here once we're through kind of the bulk of the text of here and the questions that have come up with it. And that's some of absolutely the conversation we're having today. But I just want to keep going through this because, among other things, Section 911, Climate Disaster Mitigation, Preparedness, and Response, which talks about essentially on ensuring uninterrupted provision of basic services to utilities to city residents. Not a whole lot of questions that have come up there, but the next one that has had a lot of conversation on it.
Could I touch really quickly on that last point about what the city can do? I think it's important for people to understand that El Paso Electric and our electric company, our electric utility, is a necessity in our region, right?
Certainly.
This is not a sports arena, or this is not another issue that, you know, is sort of a commercial asset.
A nice to have.
Exactly, a nice to have. This is an essential thing. We cannot live in a highland desert without AC and without access to food in our refrigerator, our medical needs. So that in and of itself gives the city a lot of power to act on behalf of the people, because it is a utility. It is an essential. It is not a luxury good. And so I just wanted to say that is what municipalization should be focusing on, and framing it as though this is something of a shoe company, a cell phone company, anything other than a necessity. is sort of distracting from like why the city even exists, right? The city exists to provide the services essential for its citizens to live a quality life. Yeah.
Okay, so again, making sure that there is still, I mean, one of the questions that has come up kind of adjacent to this, if not exactly in the text, has been about the reliability and the continued supply of it. So would you say that within the municipalization idea of it, and also kind of in the solar generation, all of these subsidiary plans and parts of it, that ensuring the accessibility and arguably even the current supply of electricity is maintained would be a focus in y'all's mind?
That everybody who needs electricity has it and uses it as they need, yes.
Okay, so on the, well, again, 9, that was about 9:10 in the previous one, but on section 9:12 on water conservation, one of the ones that has been the most focused on 9.12-1, ban on using city water for fossil fuel industry activities outside of city limits. The city of El Paso shall not sell or transfer any water for purposes of fossil fuel industry activities outside of the city limits, or otherwise allow any city water to be used for such purposes, except as provided in sections, the following sections, including, but do have contracts to sell that, and goes into a little bit more depth on that. But so some of the questions come up just on El Paso Electric on its own, such as the Newman 6 power plant or other such things. Also, other points have been brought up about that's kind of one of the leading questions about like gas stations we were talking about before, but also where that supply goes to in the region. We've had even callers from, say, points east or southern New Mexico questioning about, given the scope of this and how it could affect communities, I mean, directly outside of the city of El Paso, certainly is directly within that language, but even those that have, I mean, like, say, Horizon City, questions come up. There is a municipal water supply there, but if there are people that are currently, or systems, organizations, businesses, etc., that currently have these contracts that may be in this sphere. I know that a lot of the focus is on power generation, but if there are any of these businesses, what would the impact on those be from this item? This, again, 912, water conservation.
And so you're asking how would small businesses be affected by not being able to sell water outside of the city?
Or purchase the water, yes.
Well, that's... I mean, first off, I want to say, like, El Paso Water Utility has come out and said that they don't do that, right? That they don't sell any water to any, and they don't have any contracts to sell water outside the city, and they never have. So I find it kind of confusing that if that's the case, why would they be against this? If it's sort of reinforcing what's already the standard. But most of this is again talking about the energy utility, right? How we're using water to throw millions of gallons of water to cool off these electric facilities.
Right.
I mean, in theory, I guess we could find a business that's out there, but right now there's I'm not seeing that sort of issue, and maybe that's just me from my perspective. But though the idea of us using our waters for ourselves and using it as a utility that is precious in a desert, to me, is really reasonable, and I think most El Pasoans find it very reasonable. We do have a Paso Water Utility that provides services, like you said, to Horizon City and to other places like that. Those commitments are still going to be there, right? People are going to be able to get water to their businesses and their facilities. This has nothing to do with like personal water usage. This has to do with water usage being sold to fossil fuel industries.
So as among kind of the, not exactly in the text we're talking about, but some of the things that have come up as of this week, a little bit earlier, El Paso Matters out with the article titled El Paso Climate Charter, if approved, halts water sales to El Paso electric power plants, again, dated April 10th by Diego Mendoza Moyers, and it specifically lists 2 of the power generation facilities in the area, such as the Montana Power Station and the Rio Grande plant in Sunland Park, sitting just outside of the El Paso city limits, and further notes that El Paso Electric, quoting directly from the article, El Paso Electric purchased nearly 171 million gallons of water from El Paso Water Utilities in 2021 for the Montana and Rio Grande plants at a price of roughly $700,000. According to financial data from El Paso Water Utilities and El Paso Electric. So again, that we'll link that along with some of the postings we're doing with this full video. So essentially, that's the focus that you're having when it comes to this item and of the essentially related concept with it, again, 912 water conservation within the climate charter. That kind of activity is the focus.
Sorry, can you rephrase that again?
Sure thing. So that kind of sale, that again, roughly $700,000 of the contract for the cooling of the plants of El Paso Electric, again, the Montana and Rio Grande plants being noted specifically about El Paso matters here. That is the type of activity that's the primary focus for the, again, 912 section water conservation.
Yes.
So sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry, if I could interject too. When we were drafting the policy, Andrew, the water conservation aspect was very specific to protecting our community from the oil industry in the Permian Basin, especially. So this was drafted more to protect our community from that. If El Paso Electric, I think a lot of folks have shifted the conversation over to El Paso Electric and the way that they require the water to cool the plants. And that might be an ongoing conversation. That would require a long conversation with city government, right? That would be one of the contracts that they would probably have to review, right, and discuss if this is where that's applicable. However, this was drafted specifically to protect the community from the impact of the fossil fuel industry in the Permian, and especially, once we experience the sale of our utility, we've been left completely vulnerable to the fact that this is our only electric company in the El Paso area that who runs our electrical grid. We are very much vulnerable to any type of, other business affiliated with JP Morgan that could reach out easily from the Permian Basin and try to make those connections. And we would already have that link here through El Paso Electric to make it that much more easier for them to conduct business as usual, and now leave our community even more at stake of not having access to our own water resources. So this was very much written to protect our community from the impact of the fossil fuel industry in the Permian, their contributions to the global climate crisis, and now they've been designated this name of the Permian climate bomb, right, because of their impact on the global climate crisis. And Texas is seeing the way from El Paso to the Gulf and New Mexico, all across our region, how the Permian Basin, the pipelines that are connected, that have connected across from the Gulf to the Permian, from the Permian to El Paso, from the Permian to New Mexico. We are now seeing the way that this is negatively impacting our communities, and we are just that much more vulnerable now in the hands of a bank that funds the climate crisis, making these decisions for our community. We're very much at risk of being exploited for our water resources. So this was drafted with that intention of protecting our community, our resources especially, and using them for clean energy production, specific to our community as well.
So would it essentially be the position of this item then, particularly from the reporting we're talking about with, with providement contracts, among other things, purchasing specific water, would there be essentially a delineation that would be made when it comes to this item, again, if passed by this upcoming election, that there would be a difference between essentially metered access, again, residential or small business use, versus essentially the mass amount, 171 million gallons in scope for El Paso Electric? Would that be essentially delineated, would be the purpose of this item?
Could you rephrase that, Andrew, a little bit?
Yeah, sure thing. So basically drawing a difference between, say, someone who has a water meter on their house and is paid for by their usage, as opposed to the total amount and just the total scale of what is being provided from the water utility. Would it be the intention of y'all with this item to delineate between the two of those and focus primarily on the latter than the mass use and again the fossil fuel activities?
Yes. 100%.
Yes. If you get water from El Paso Water Utilities for your home and your business outside of El Paso, you are still going to be getting water from that. We have the desalinization plant here, which is such a critical resource for our community. All the more reason why we should not be selling it to industries who use it neglectfully.
One of the final questions actually on the text itself anyway would also be on the elimination of impediments to renewable energy, saying the city shall not, section 9.13, city shall not impose any fines, fees, or other financial or non-financial burdens that limit that purchase, use, or generation of renewable energy. Any such fines, fees, or other burdens in existence at the time this charter amendment takes effect are hereby null and void, including but not limited to interconnection fees. So there exists certain requirements within Texas. Basically, the reason that, there has been some conversation nationwide, I want to say, on the idea of like selling your power back to utilities, et cetera, the way it exists in El Paso. And in previous conversations we've had with representatives from El Paso Electric, there is not the, seeing a negative balance on your bill, essentially, in Texas as it exists, because there's always going to be a minimum fee level. So you can eliminate a majority, if not all, of the, say, per kilowatt hour charges, but there's always going to be a minimum. Is it essentially the intention of that item to say that that would no longer be allowable within the city limits of El Paso?
Yes, and to kind of bring a better example of it, I think it was in 2013 and 2014, anybody who put solar panels on their home and produced the electricity for themselves and produced a surplus and gave it back to the electrical grid with El Paso Electric were actually charged money to put money back into that they produced to give back to El Paso Electric. And so this is meant to prevent against that, and as well to incentivize the other way, right? If the city, let's say, decides to put solar panels on all its public libraries and all its other buildings and is then producing a surplus of energy and gives it back to El Paso Electric would then be responsible to pay a fair price for that electricity that they're producing. And that's what this provision is aiming for.
So 2 questions come up related to this, and then also the previous item about essentially local rules that would come on, again, the provisions and providing of water, or again, the requirements of essentially the fees interconnection specifically, as is mentioned there when it comes to those. Some of these things come not just out of our area, but our state of Texas rules, among other things. So questions have arisen about essentially if these would be able to be put into place and essentially enforced, given that there are other statewide requirements that come onto these, particularly when it comes to fossil fuel activities, in specific when it comes to the water conservation. So when it comes to that interplay, I mean, towards the end of the whole climate charter, there is, mention of, removal, severability, those kind of things. So there is the concept of if something is not able to be enforced, the rest of it would still be in place. That's not the question here, but specifically of these sections and of the enforcement of them in the current situation, given the laws in the state of Texas, are these still possible? Would these be able to be put into place as the way you've discussed them?
If you were to ask the state, of course they're going to say no, right? But that's the intent, and that's our whole value statement of ourselves as an organization. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to change the status quo. We're trying to challenge these rules that say that you cannot, as a municipality, decide where your water goes. We anticipate, as evident with the attacks of us from fossil fuel and Chamber of Commerce, it's very clear that when you have a monopoly over a region's energy usage and water, you can use it however you want. And it's very evident that when we are coming up here and saying that we want to give the power back to the people, that is obviously going to have a direct impact on their profits. And so our motivation and our sort of thinking behind this is, yes, we are aware that the state has these provisions that do not put forth our community and the things that we need in our interests, in our hearts, in our minds, in our community. But that is not a deterrent for us, because we are trying to push and for change in these areas. And we're fortunately not the only ones in Texas doing this, So there are other organizations, there are other fights there are many cities in Texas that have municipalized their energy. There are many other cities in Texas that have stricter regulations on where their water rights go for certain things.
Responses to fracking, other things like that have come up, and the response from the state has been, not even in just this legislative session, but in previous ones, of essentially banning that practice or that availability. The state has shown, particularly in this arena, a willingness to reach out into the local level and say this is prohibited, leading to further court cases, certainly. So is that, with the recognition of that activity having coming from specifically the state of Texas, then is it the intention to move forward with that? It's in the ballot, it's in the language, it's what's going to be voted on, but when it comes to actually then implementing it, again, if approved, is it the intention to just move forward this kind of damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, or under the standing that there is going to be probably significant legal challenges or even removal of these sections?
Absolutely. I'm sorry if y'all want to respond.
Christina or Veronica?
I don't go for it, Dominic. That's okay.
Yeah. No, I was going to say it's to be expected. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It is to be expected that they're going to challenge that, and I think the fact that we are seeing our state government act so hostile towards the will of the people on the local level says a lot. And without getting too much into the ideological differences of the left or the right, at the end of the day, we are trying to protect our democracy, and we believe that to protect our democracy requires people to buy in to the things that we are fighting for, the protections for our own community. And of course, the state government, which is in bed with fossil fuel industries, is going to have a problem and is going to come fight on behalf of the fossil fuel industry against the will of the people. But at the end of the day, 39,000 people signed this initiative because they care about the environment, not because they're concerned about future lawsuits. And so this is a very standard sort of situation for our community historically of people coming together to try to fight these big special interests and these big state powers who are so far away from where we are. I want to remind everybody, we are the only state, probably other than Alaska, that has to drive 8 hours to go participate into our own state politics, right? We are so isolated. We are the last thought, if any thought, on the state legislation. But that doesn't mean that we as local citizens cannot use our own local power to say, we want this for our community. And if that means that the city of El Paso has to fight against the city, or against the state of Texas in legal battles, I don't think that should be a deterrent for us to not even try at all. It's to be expected that they're going to combat on behalf of the fossil fuel industries, but we as El Pasoans, we know our worth. We know that better is possible, and we know that we are the solar capital of the world. You do not have to be a rocket scientist to recognize that we are not tapping into our solar potential. We are sitting on a gold mine of solar energy, and we could be leading not only our community, but the state in renewable energy productions, should we just be able to relinquish ourselves from the grip of fossil fuels. And so that question to me is really a question of there are going to be people fighting you in the distance. There are going to be people fighting you and challenging you. But for us, that's to be expected. And we know what we're worth, and we know what our goals are. So we're going to commit to that and stay fighting.
Again, if you're just joining us, that right there is Dominic Chacon, communications coordinator for Sunrise El Paso, and also joining us on the phone here are Christian Marquardt, communications coordinator with the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition, and Veronica Carbajal, president of Justicia Fronteriza. Again, you want to find out information about what they're putting out or on these organizations. There's sunriseelpaso.org as well as elpasoclimate.org. And again, if you want to find out what's actually on the ballot, epcountyvotes.com. And again, the early voting going on April 24th through May 2nd, and Election Day on May 6th. This is one of the many items on there, but certainly one of the ones that has had some of the most interest and items going on to it here. Was there something that you wanted to add, Christian?
Yes, there was, just briefly, Andrew. Just to that point as well about, certain concerns of what if this section of the climate charter suddenly is deemed not legal or not coinciding with, state law. And the way it was drafted, we did have a team of lawyers who are very familiar with the state law, at least especially at the time when we drafted it, who felt very confident and reassured that, the policy as it was drafted, as it stands now, at least in respect to, state policy back when we were drafting it, was, consistent with state law. However, we have seen, of course, at the state level, many efforts to challenge climate action in communities, especially at the municipal level, and also challenges from the state government regarding, El Paso is considered a home rule municipality in the state of Texas, and so Texas has been pushing a bill, I believe it's HB 2127, to try to remove, the ability for municipalities to still function with some level of independence, more specific to their community's needs, away from state government. And so something that was really important that we included within the policy, and you'll notice it at the end of the document, is the severability clause, which is just such a significant part to the piece itself, because what it does is it protects that the document as a whole from being thrown out, and it ensures that if there's a section or a piece of it that is not compliant, aligned with state law, that would be the sole part that is removed from the policy itself. Right. And so we wanted to ensure that protection was there, understanding that we're navigating a very tricky situation between trying to make these more independent, specific decisions for our community within a state that is currently challenging, our ability to make those decisions. And so that was a piece of the policy that I just wanted to highlight a bit there as well.
Yeah, entirely so, because that has been one of the biggest questions that has come in, though one of the ones also kind of the last section that we haven't directly covered here would be that on the Climate Commission and the appointment therein. I mean, certainly an important part of the overall bit of it. Not a lot of questions that have come up, at least to me on our end, that being kind of the directional body, the non-elected officials who go on to it. They are appointed and serve without salary. Just mentioning that, but it hasn't quite come up that much. I want to go back to the top of the document itself, back to the definitions. We mentioned a few of them and focus on at least some of them, but one of the biggest, I guess, conversations, maybe not necessarily questions, has come up from the definition of particularly climate justice. I'm going to read it here on its own. So this is definitions 9.2 and the item C, climate justice, ensuring that historically underserved communities do not bear a disproportionate share of the negative impacts of climate change, while at the same time investing in those same communities as parts of the work to respond to climate change, mitigate its impacts, and build an environmentally sustainable society. For purposes of this analysis, historically underserved communities include Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people with disabilities, and people living at or below the poverty line. So, Veronica, if you're actually still on with us there, I want to direct that one to you specifically, given the work of your organization, among other things, Justicia Fronteriza, and there have been similar types of things come up here. So when it comes to that, and then it's mentioned in a few other places within the actual text of this item, but as a concept and how it applies to this, what's kind of your perspective and how that informs the rest of what maybe doesn't explicitly mention it, but is certainly, it's part of the definitions that go into it? Okay, I don't think we have Veronica with us there now, so I'll kick that over to Christian or Dominic. How would you like to kind of talk about how that is kind of integrated into the rest of it and kind of what that concept means?
Yeah, thank you for
Hi,
that.
everyone. I can jump in real quick. And
there we go.
I do have to jump off.
Sure thing, Veronica.
I believe the question is about climate justice and environmental justice communities.
Yeah, certainly. Basically, that definition, how it's not necessarily explicitly mentioned in all of the rest of the items, certainly not in all of them, in certain ones of them, but then just how that concept essentially informs the rest of it and how you see that impact of that concept within the document as a whole.
Well, I think that the document as a whole is forcing all of us to, especially our city officials, to look at decisions through the lens of those who are most impacted by issues related to climate injustice. And when we can call them frontline or fence line communities, and that's a legal term. The fence line communities have standing before, for instance, the TCQ when it comes to an air permit in fighting, polluters like El Paso Electric. And often we don't think about them. We get in our cars and we drive past them, but these communities are impacted not just by the power plant, but also the refinery, by transportation projects, by the Bridge of the Americas, expansion. And we need to start thinking about them because they're the canaries in the mine. They're the folks that are dealing with not only the pollution, but also the traffic that comes from these facilities. And they're often the least equipped to deal with the health consequences. So they have paid a very high price with the quality of their life as well as their own health bills and medical bills and other expenses related to, them breathing in polluted air, as well as contending with the noise, as well as contending with the depreciation in their property values because they're next to these facilities. And so, in El Paso, we talk a lot about property taxes and jobs, but if we're able to, at some point, take over the power plant, we have to remember that would be a source of revenue, right? There's a reason that El Paso Electric shareholders did not voluntarily give us sell us or just offer us up the plant. It's because it's a profit generating endeavor. And so we need that. El Pasoans have very high property taxes because we don't have other sources of revenue. And the utility that we do own, the water utility, is the most expensive to operate because we're in the desert. And so we have to really start thinking about what this means for the future of our local economy, as well as it has been spoken about throughout the program, the need to gain control over the kind of electricity that is generated and how it's generated.
Okay, so again, that's Veronica Carbajal, president of Justicia Fronteriza. And so going back now into some of the analysis, I think that we've covered most of the major points that have come up on this program anyway when it relates to the climate charter, some of the actual specific provisions within it, at the very least, again, displayed to us and presented to me. I'm sure there's a lot more questions and analysis that exist out there, but those are some of the major ones. Now, in some of the analysis that has come out about all of this and how it will then have an impact on there, there's, of course, as you mentioned, Dominic, the study that was done by Moscow Consulting out of Idaho that puts the actual cost of this then I do believe at a whole lot more, and I think that's Veronica signing off with us, but Christian, you're still with us, yes?
Oh, and actually, Andrew, I'm going to have to sign off as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us as well, or we continue on that conversation, but you have a good one there.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you. So, continuing on with Dominic now. So, of course, there's been a lot of analysis, meta-analysis, back and forth on these things. One of the first major ones coming out earlier this year was, of course, that actual study put out on behalf of the El Paso Chamber, saying that about $170,000, 170,000 jobs, rather, and about $8 billion between now and 2030, specifically referencing the El Paso Matters reporting on this from the article dated February 23rd, 2023. Climate Charter could cost thousands of jobs, billions in earnings, Chamber says. Subtitled, Environmentalist Who Petitions for the Climate Policy to Appear on the May Ballot Calls El Paso Chamber's Claim Fear-Mongering, just the full title and subtitle for it as well. Yeah, the climate study, among other things, the one that, again, done by the Chamber, that is, again, 170,000 job loss, $8 billion in workers' earnings lost. If implemented in their analysis, as they put it, included in those kind of things, it's a roughly 60-page document, give or take, so it goes quite in depth on it. And essentially what has also been said, including to El Paso Matters, and I'm going to quote directly from this there on the actual consultants who ended up producing this. I do have that quote here. What they said is that this is what the cost would be as their flat analysis of it on if there were to be a immediate move towards all of these things, including the cost of creating some of this power generation, the cost of purchasing El Paso Electric, or of the cost of removing the power generation facilities without replacement. That's where I think the bulk of that job loss and economic impact, the wage loss that comes with it, is from the idea of that power generation, any of the fossil fuel industry ones, being cut and not replaced effectively, and the impact that would have on essentially availability within the El Paso grid. Now, of course, the El Paso Climate Charter Group, as well as the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition, as well as Sunrise El Paso, you all have responded and said that essentially no, that this would not be a move directly towards that. In a nutshell, in your own words, what is y'all's response actually to that study? We've discussed the study previously, and some of your response, including kind of a line-by-line response to it, but kind of in a nutshell and at that high level, what is y'all's response to it?
I mean, short answer is corporations lie. We can look at the tobacco industry, right, in the 80s when they were being held accountable for the fact that their product was producing cancer and killing people. Lied until they were finally forced to admit, right? Same thing in ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil knew for a long time that their product was creating carbon emissions that were altering the climate, and they just simply lied. This should not be viewed as anything else but another, layer of those lies. And I think to call it a study is giving it, a little too much credit. A study requires, peer reviewed. A study requires open sourcing of your information and sort of really citing as much information as possible over a long period of time to make sure you get the right information. This was a paid report commissioned by the El Paso Chamber of Commerce once they found out that we were going to get this charter on the ballot. So this is their response to try to come up with something, right? But let's assume that this is a study. Let's assume that this is legit, and like we'll entertain the thought of of how to respond to this. And at the end of the day, I don't think El Paso Electric realizes how much they are actually implicated in this study.
Okay.
What this study really points out is their failure to invest in their own goals that they say they're happening. So let's talk about like the electrification, right? While the number is very high, I don't even think it's that high. It is highlighting the fact that they, as $1 billion bank that owns this company, have failed to invest in their electrification, even though that's what they say their goals are, right? They talk about transitioning jobs. But that to me reads as they have failed to train their employees into the new solar energy and renewable energy economy that's coming forward. And so to me, in those two ways, that it kind of implicates them as not investing in these things that they articulate themselves as their goals.
So essentially what we've talked about, among other things, is that, some of the concerns that have been expressed on this program, among other things, have been the idea of there being, for lack of a better term, or at least I think about it, a bottom dropping out of in order to move only to renewables, we cut off everything else. It kind of
economic fallout, I think is the term that one of them used.
Economic fallout, among other things, or another way to put it, cutting off the nose despite the face. That has come up a couple of times here. Is it the intention of you all to kind of pursue that course, or to essentially be more there are some timelines mentioning 2045 to that 100% renewable or clean renewables, as again is defined in there. So when it comes to there being goals is something that you all have mentioned a lot. Is it the intention and the way that it should be, you all intend to have it interpreted, if again passed and put into the city charter, that something that would reduce the reliability of the grid? There are certain other provisions you have on there on ensuring electrical and other utility access, that if there was being contravention of that, say towards achieving those goals, if there wouldn't to be that facilities or that capability, if there were setbacks, those kind of things, that if, say, we get those deadlines, say the one about the 80% generation by the 2030s, that if that is not able to be achieved, it would not be a too bad, so sad, we got to turn off this other part of it, essentially?
That and their whole assessment in which they get to that doomsday scenario is just inaccurate. On page 11 of the study, and I encourage anybody who can get in front of it to read up to it, is where they predicate their doomsday scenario, basically. Their doomsday scenario comes from what you just said, that no matter how hard we try, we're not going to be able to produce enough solar energy to meet our energy demands. And because of that, as you said, businesses are just going to apparently just devolve. Nobody's going to be able to, even that scenario is already a stretch. But the way they get there is completely, has nothing to do with anything set by the climate charter. There's a point on page 11 in the bottom where they talk about their moderate solarization rate on the last paragraph. So last paragraph. In our economic impact assessment, we do not assume this lofty solarization pathway for El Paso in the future, and that lofty goal being the one set by the climate charter, which is reach 80% renewable by 2030 and then 100% by 2045. And that rate, we would need 113 megawatts to be added to our electric grid every year. So that's the rate set by the climate charter. But instead of designing their economic model on that rate that is set by the climate charter, they decided to come up with what they called a more moderate solarization model, which is only 12 megawatts installed per year. So if I can put forth an analogy, it's like saying, hey, El Paso, we want to get to Dallas, Texas by this time. And if we need to get to there by this time, we need to go 113 miles per hour. I don't recommend anybody travel that fast, but just for the analogy, right? And we're saying we need to get to 113 miles per hour every year to get to this destination or close to it, right?
Okay.
El Paso, the Moscow study has, without any sort of explanation, chosen a more moderate solarization model, which is only 12 megawatts per year. And that's like saying we're going to try to get to Dallas at 12 miles per hour. Well, of course, at 12 miles per hour, we're never going to get to our energy demand. We're never going to meet that. And so it's sort of it's a nice study and all, but it's predicated on something that is not in the climate charter. And from there is where they start to paint their whole doomsday scenario, that this is what's going to cause businesses to fall out. This is going to cause these things to happen. And it's just not true. If you go to El Paso Electric on their own website, they're saying that they can add up to 700 by, I think it was 2025, which is way faster than the climate charter. But again, we don't know where this 12 megawatts installed per year comes from. But this is just an example of how these corporations produce a really complicated, overly unnecessarily complicated document that really just says a whole lot of nothing. At the end of the day, we've talked to Austin economists, and I think El Paso Matters might have interviewed them too, and very clearly said these are goals that already exist in other Texas cities. These are goals that are very reasonable to achieve. Are they going to be completely easy and a walk in the park? Absolutely not, but they are achievable. But rather than engage in the substantive conversation, the El Paso Chamber of Commerce and El Paso Electric choose to fearmonger and choose to really lie and manipulate information and manipulate data to make it seem as though it's impossible, even though they say themselves this is where they're trying to go as a business. So it's really hard to engage in these conversations in good faith, and to ask ourselves, what does this all mean at the end of the day? For another example is they price El Paso Electric at somewhere close to $9 billion that we would have to buy. I mean, I don't think anybody needs to be economists, but how would we get from $4.3 billion in 2018 to $9 billion in whatever year they're saying, you know? That is a huge just assumption at the end of the day. I get that might be how they internally want to value their company, but it's not based on any assessment. They're not saying this is our grid that we have. This is what we can do, is what we can't do. All they are saying is this is what we can't do. And that's to be expected of an industry who has a monopoly over a region.
There's more points I want to get into here, but just specifically on that one, a point that has come up, or a question that's come up about particularly the sale, again, the municipalization, get that you talked about it, and the variety of tools, ways that this could be accomplished, but from the sale aspect of it, I mean, it is a now privately held company that may be part of a publicly traded one, but it is owned. It is owned and was purchased, and it's again for that, $4 billion and change. So one of those questions that has come up, particularly on that point, is of the willingness to sell, the willingness of willing to submit to a purchase. I mean, there's a phrase out there, anything is possible if money is no object. But once you start talking about, I mean, we've had enough heartache over hundreds of millions of dollar bonds in this area with voters in recent years. When we start talking about that kind of a chunk of change and being willing to achieve it, and I get the importance and the distinction that you all are making between a regular bond project and the ones that have regularly gone on, or like say the arena, etc., and this as being of paramount importance, but giving the willingness of the community and the fact that it may not be considered as for sale except for such an exorbitant type of price. I guess, how do you all respond to that concept of, again, all available efforts does not necessarily require it to be done in any kind of immediate time frame, but if these are the kind of roadblocks that are in the way, what is really the feasibility of doing that in the long run for anything besides maybe even tens of billions of dollars?
Again, it goes back to that point I had us go back to, is that electricity is a human right. You need electricity to live, right? If somebody owned the water in El Paso and simply didn't want to sell it, that's not the role of city government. The role of city government is to ensure that we have all the things that we need to live a dignified life, to live with all the things that we need. Electricity is one of those things. And so from my perspective, and I say this as a young organizer who's been organizing in El Paso for 13 years, is that it reads to me as they called us irresponsible, right, for not doing an economic assessment for a climate charter. I think their inability to engage in this honest conversation in a substantive way is what's really irresponsible, right? Just if they didn't want to sell their company, which it sounds like that's what they are going for, that should reveal to us their true intentions, right? They're not intent on providing electricity to the community because we need it, right? They're in the business of making money. And if they can make money by selling to fossil fuels and neglecting our utility ratepayers, which they have, right? They're going to continue to do that. They're going to continue to prioritize all the money they can make by selling their energy to fracked gas and oil industries in the Permian Basin. While we, as the ratepayers, are already paying this high rate of electricity that is one of the highest in the countries, and we're constantly seeing it increase and increase. Even though we are a region with a fixed economy, we don't have a booming industry here that's giving us more resources, and so we're already paying for it. We can use the city powers to simply start breaking the chains off of it. We don't even necessarily have to buy right now, or even within the next few years, El Paso Electric to start seeing the impacts of this charter if it does pass. Like as I said, we could be having our school districts putting solar panels on their schools, and that would be saving so much money for the school districts every single year that the community would then see. And vice versa, our hospitals, our city buildings, our libraries, there are other things that we can do outside of straight up buying them before we even get to that part of really assessing how much their stuff is worth, which again, the Moscow study, according to this study that they want to tout, is saying that their infrastructure right now is subpar.
Yeah, the Points Consulting based out of Moscow, Idaho, study you're referring to there, titled the El Paso Climate Charter Economic Impact Assessment, done for the El Paso Chamber of Commerce and produced by January 31st of this year by, again, Points Consulting. And you all have had your own response to this as well, a roughly, I think I had it up here, a roughly 10-page document kind of line by line, or at least the major points that you all have reporting to that, again, as co-signed on by the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition, Sunrise El Paso, and Ground Game Texas, released about midway through previous month, March 17th, when that one, and contact for that actually with Christian, again, who was just with us on the line here. So that is part of it, and you've responded to some of that as well. But getting down to a more immediate economic analysis, more recently than that, the city of El Paso has said that it would cost about $150 million between now and 2045 for the specifically for city government aspects of this, when it includes both the creation of the climate department, funding of the position for the climate director, any of those transitions, as well as particularly the solar electrification part of it, the creation of that, and saying they're moving towards that for just city facilities doing that, that being about $150 million, with also one major other inclusion of the studies into that part on the municipalization on what it would take. So the actual feasibility studies in two parts, all of that, and probably a few more finer points that I haven't gotten to there, being rolled up into that. Haven't seen too much back and forth on that for people wanting to reference that. The El Paso Matters article from March 23rd, written by Diego Mendoza Moyers. El Paso Climate Charter would cost $150 million to enact, consultant says. So when it comes to that particular study, that specific aspect of what it would mean for the city's bottom line over the next, again, through 2045, what is y'all's response or analysis of that?
We think that that's great. That's what we're wanting, right? Is these assessments to be like, how much is it really going to cost? How much do we think we can really need? How much do we really think we can act within a certain timeline? And if anything, I think that really shows that the numbers within this Moscow study that's being cited by the Chamber of Commerce are inflated, right? Because it's not going
completely different scopes we're talking about here. One would be not even just the government of El Paso, which is the $150 million, the analysis done by, again, the Points Consulting out of Moscow, Idaho, is of the entire economic impact. And I guess essentially the way I see it is that theirs is of the potential for the bottom falling out, and what you all are essentially in response to that study is that no, this would be reasonable. Is that kind of a, in a nutshell, kind of response that you all have to it?
We're saying that the fallout that they're describing is completely fabricated.
That you all would be reasonable to avoid that, essentially, in the implementation.
It's not even that it's avoidable. It's just it would not exist. You know what I mean? The doomsday scenario that they are wanting to paint is just from their fever dreams of losing their own profits, right? They're not concerned with the profits or the pocketbooks of everyday El Pasoans. Their assessment of the money that they're going to lose and the bottom falling out is simply for them as a fossil fuel industry. So when they say we are going to lose profits, they're not talking about everyday El Pasoans. They're talking about themselves and the industries that they represent. The feasibility study from the city of El Paso,
the $150 million,
is a much more reasonable feasibility study. Is it going to cost money to put together resources and to put together staff and make sure we hire the best? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, those investments are going towards the community for community input and for a community to receive the benefits of that investment. Whereas as the other assessments and studies, quote, studies done by the Chamber of Commerce and their consultants are simply to spread misinformation and disinformation.
So do you all find yourself agreeing with that City of El Paso analysis, that again, $150 million, more or less all told, except for the full municipalization of El Paso Electric between now and 2045?
We agree that, we accept it as a study that was done. We definitely think that there are more studies that can be done that show different ones. But yeah, we think $150 million to invest in a climate department and a climate director are very reasonable budgets within the city.
Yeah, some of the stuff that, among other things, you all been putting out on social media is saying that this would cost, once implemented and fully up to speed, about $5 million a year. Is that the kind of figure that you all have come down to of what this addition to the charter would actually add to, like, essentially the bottom line for the city of El Paso?
Yeah, it's hard to say because, as Vero had mentioned earlier, electric generation in this area is a very fruitful income. It can generate a lot of money.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
And so by us owning and municipalizing a certain aspect of that grid for ourselves, we would be able to, it would pay for itself after so many years, after we expand it to a certain level. And this is something we discussed in the Regional Renewable Energy Advisory Committee. As we continue, the technology continues to develop, solar energy and wind energy and these renewable energy grids become more and more feasible because they become more and more inexpensive, more accessible for people to be using on a regular basis. And so if we started now, we have to put up a little bit of front of money to get that infrastructure. But in the long run, it would pay for itself and then some. And so that's the thing. And so the whole 150 for the climate department and to get that sort of basic infrastructure makes sense, but it's an investment that will pay off.
Okay. And again, one of the finer points of that and of the analysis the city has put out of those costs include basically $12 to $15 million included with that of doing two-part feasibility studies for the municipalization of El Paso Electric specifically. So outside of, also included there, they don't refer to it as municipalization. I get what you're referring to it there about increasing municipal generation is an aspect of municipalization. But in the analysis and the way the city of El Paso has put this forth, and some of this is available over on elpasotexas.gov, among other things, it has that. It would be a two-part study. The first one, which would take roughly like a year to year and a half, would be phase one, to look to see if there are deeper questions to be asked about or deeper things to be delved into when it comes to the actual municipalization purchase and therefore municipal control, to break that down further, of El Paso Electric or its substantive production facilities on its own. That would be the first part of it. And then the second part will then delve into, okay, what are the specific actions to be taken? That would be the rest of the bulk of the chunk and change between like $8 and $10 million. And that one would take on the order of years to fully complete in that way. So that is included. So I will say that the City of El Paso analysis on the cost of the climate charter does not include the full municipalization, the full realization of, again, that Section 9.10 municipalization of El Paso Electric, but it sets the road to that as well, because essentially out of those studies is what the argument is by the City of El Paso would come the question on what that would cost based on the methods that are deemed available and most viable given the whole, all available efforts language that is included there.
Exactly.
Okay, so with those numbers in place and those considerations in there as well, there has been some further analysis, further article from El Paso Matters dated March 29th of this year. El Paso property tax rate could increase under climate charter, city leaders say. You did mention about there being income that is possible from this, particularly from solar generation. Now, of course, currently not possible, at the very least, if there were to be solar panels installed right now in the city of El Paso using them, because of, again, the minimum costs that are required, the interconnection fees, etc., that are required. So that is kind of the idea of this, therefore, beyond the investment, then to starting to see results from it even before the purchase of El Paso Electric would be predicated upon that one section that we discussed about the actual removal of all fees being actually in place. That one section, 9.13, elimination of impediments of renewable energy, including taking about all fees null and void, including but not limited to interconnection fees. That would essentially be the requirement to see that part realized, then it sounds like.
Rephrase that question, I'm sorry.
So to see the actual money being made off of it, the benefits before even the purchase of El Paso Electric from, say, the creation of solar panels, it would require that section about the removal of all fees to go into effect to see that realized.
I assume so. I think there's more to it. There's lots more nuance. I think, of course, the Chamber of Commerce and, of course, El Paso Electric are going to imagine the worst case scenario in every scenario, right? But adopting the climate charter actually opens us up to a lot more federal grants and just regular renewable energy grants. For example, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has a lot of resources that cities and municipalities can be tapping into to supplement their energy grids, right? To start that process. So, of course, the oligarchs know that people are scared of their property taxes rising, as they should be. But let's be honest, the property taxes have been rising not because of city infrastructure going back to citizens, but city resources going to private hands and private interests. So that's just another fear-mongering talking point. At the end of the day, this climate charter allows us to start tapping into other funds and other sources rather than just our property tax base here. We, like I said, the IRA, there's millions of dollars, billions of dollars that could be had, you know, and especially here in El Paso, where we have, again, so much potential to be leading not only our area, but the state. We could be tapping into that money. There's lots of grants. There's lots of foundations that are willing to help support cities. We just have to have that infrastructure ready to go looking for that, ready to be applying to that. Currently, we don't have anybody who cares about that stuff because we have an electric company that's committed to fossil fuels and committed to telling us that they want to change, but never doing it. So this will give us that opportunity to tap in those financial sources in other ways. And so sure, it would require that clause to some extent, but
sure, okay.
But there's an array of doors that open, you know, when we adopt the climate charter like this.
We've talked quite at length as we're now just past the 2-hour mark for the entirety of this interview. And again, for those listening on air with us as we are presenting this today, this full interview is going to be available online on our social media outlets, either shortly after or before too long on there. So we'll have that linked along with the articles we've been talking about as well. So you can see all of the details that we've been getting into, the language of the ordinance and all of those things. But we've had a lot of conversation. I mean, there have been a lot of points that have been brought up on this program for, against, or just kind of questioning what this would mean and what the impacts would be. From y'all's perspective, again, you all are some of the organizing aspects of this. You have put this forth and are very vocally proponents of this. Again, some of those websites, sunriseelpaso.org and elpasoclimate.org. We've, again, gotten into a lot of detail, but bring this back to the high level. In a nutshell, for anyone that is wondering why they should support this, kind of in a nutshell, what do you say to them?
In order for something better to happen and to occur, there's a few things that need to happen before that. Number one, we need to realize that we deserve better, and we need to fathom the idea of what better looks like. And I don't think we need to tap that hard into the imagination of El Pasoans for them to recognize that we are not using solar energy the way we could be. And I don't think it takes an economist or political scientist or anything for us to realize that when we tap into that, we can actually create an economic boom. We can create a huge resource of jobs, and we can, again, be leading the state and our nation and even the world in solar energies. But of course, if you ask the people who currently profit off the way things are, of course they're going to be upset about it. Of course they're not going to want to have to share the market that they wouldn't have to compete in. Of course they're going to be upset. Hence why they're throwing so much money and throwing so much information out there to stoke fear, right? And what I want people to remember is, number one, everything that's in this climate charter are things that El Paso Electric, El Paso Water Utilities have claimed are their values. So all we are doing is asking them to commit to those values in a way that holds the community accountable and holds them accountable to the community. And so I as frustrating as it is to have to engage with such what feel like bad faith actors, I still want to call them in and say, if you care about this community, let's engage in this conversation in a much deeper way. Throwing fear and throwing, all these numbers and reports that, apparently a lot of people haven't even read, do not help the conversation, right? We need to engage in a much more meaningful way. And that's what we've been doing as a community group and organization. And 39,000 people did not sign the climate charter because they're concerned about El Paso Electric's profits or the profits of the fossil fuel industry. They signed it because they see the reality in front of them. They see days where wind is blowing beyond anything they can't even see to their neighbor's house. They see the rising price of electricity, and they see how our summers are getting hotter and drier, and they do not want what is being presented to us as an option anymore. And so we can achieve better, and we will achieve better as long as we work together. I do not want to villainize the people of El Paso Chamber of Commerce, even though I feel as though they might have been doing that to the youth. And I think we also need to remember that the youth that are taking on this fight are actually accepting responsibility for an issue that they have very little, if anything, to do with. The climate crisis that we are in today is not because of them, yet here they are working hand in hand with community to build an understanding. We've been fighting for economic justice and climate justice since 2018, 2019, and there have been people who've been doing it before us, like Veronica Carbajal, amongst others. And so I just want people to realize that, like, as much as they want to frame us as outsiders, that we don't know what we're talking about, the Moscow study, JP Morgan Chase, all these people are not from El Paso. They do not understand the nuance in our community, and they do not understand our realization that we can do better. And so I just want to encourage everybody to read the climate charter. It's a little long, but I think maybe beyond the word municipalization, that might be the only word people have to really Google. But it is meant to be a document that is for people to understand, much like the Constitution, right? Much like, simply worded statements that really address our values. So I encourage everybody to read it. Check out sunriseelpasotexas.org, along with Justicia Fronteriza and a lot of our other collaborative orgs.
Again, guest with us right now has been Dominic Chacon, communications coordinator with Sunrise El Paso, and also on the phone with us a little bit earlier were Veronica Carbajal, president of Justicia Fronteriza, and Christian Marquardt, communications coordinator with the El Paso Climate Charter Coalition. Again, those websites that we were mentioning for more information on directly from the organizations we've been talking about today, sunriseelpaso.org and elpasoclimate.org. And again, for the text that we are talking about when it comes to the actual climate charter, if you want to see what's on the ballot, epcountyvotes.com. And of course, don't forget the May election that this item is on the ballot for, with among many other ballot items. And we have different school boards and municipal elections in our region. There's a lot on this ballot. Early voting April 24th through May 2nd, and then election day on May 6th. So make your plan to go vote. So we've talked about a lot today, and we're going to be posting all of this, again, the full interview online. But for those who have joined us on air, we've tried to break down the most important points or bring you the most significant parts of what we talked about today. So again, Dominic, and on behalf of the other people you had with you, thank you very much for joining us here today to break this down, get in depth on it, and answer some of the questions we've had here today.
No, thank you so much for giving us the time. This was a really substantive conversation. We really appreciate that.
All right, certainly. So thank you very much.